I find interesting anyway is around the question of being and doing. We're often known as being an artist, but very few people seem to know what it is artists do. In fact, quite frequently, they seem to think artists don't do anything. So I'm kind of curious, what brought you to being an artist, and of course the question of doing something as an artist?
I do have a working class origin, so the idea of doing always means, for me, some kind of labor, and I had teachers who rightfully took me to task for that. I went to the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and people would question there in the 70s and 80s whether you should be an artist, whether you should have a studio, whether you were really wasting your time. And very often people would say, why do you have a studio? Do you have a show coming up? Or why are you making, or even, why are you making this work? What's going on? So I think my the working class impulses took over at some point with me, because I do make a lot of work, and but I think of it the way some people might think of knitting. That you do this repetitive activity, and the work, in my case, usually produces itself. I'll start painting and then see where it goes. It's, in a sense, most of the things I do, I guess you call them from memory. Although I do a lot of life drawing and drawings I never show. I make almost everything up. So in a way it's like daydreaming, or in some ways it's not really like a activity at all, because it's not really, it's directionless in a way. Aside from my format, I allow myself to paint anything, so I do know about, and I'm conscious of issues of labor and art, and I've always had a job, so and I think that I've had a job, but I've also had a peculiar relationship with money that I think might be essential for a visual artist. And that is a willingness to risk your life is nothing, but your financial life on art, and I've done that.
I was struck by the passport series you did when you were a kid at Expo 67.
Well, I found it. This is a little passport book, and I think of it as my first work of art. And,
such a lovely idea.
What I did was, in grade 7, I went to Expo 67, and I ignored everything in the pavilions in order to get these stamps that every pavilion was giving out, as if you were entering a country. They would stamp your little pass book, and I retrospectively think of this as my first work of art. I was in grade 7 in 1967, so I was aware of conceptual art, but only later on did I discover that this was my first work, my first serious work. But Expo 67 was my introduction to contemporary art. Before that, my uncle had brought back some Inuit carvings. But aside from that, we did not have art around the house. It was not something you would have. So Expo 67, my strongest memory from Expo 67 was a black and white palette knife painting by Paul-Émile Bourgeois. And I've never forgotten it, never forgotten it. And when I look back and think back, I also seem to remember these very tall Giacometti-like sculptures that I haven't seen reproduced since, and that maybe I've just fantasized about, that were part of the sculpture displayed there.
Giacometti, it's interesting because in the Sculpture 67 exhibition, there was a lot of work that essentially came out of Expressionism. But
yes, people aren't conscious of that delay. They believe that pop art started in 1962 and 63, and then immediately the entire art world changed, but it did not, no. Right into the 60s and 70s, you had late abstract expressionism going on and all kinds of things. Yeah, our ideas of history are strange, odd.
Yeah,
Our art history are strange.
I was also struck by your comment that, I guess, Patterson Newman came as a kind of, I'm not sure if thunderbolt is the word, but certainly came as a great surprise, or I don't know, you describe it.
Well, I saw a show of Patterson Newman at Mount Allison University in 1975 that I was astonished by the roughness and crudeness of it and the sculptural quality of his work. And then later on, he did one of the most entertaining talks I've ever been at NASCAD, at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. His slides consisted of him holding up his work in his backyard with his hands wrapped around the paintings, and he talked. He could be, maybe he was being a bit fake. He talked like a folk artist, and we all knew that he wasn't, obviously. I was interested in that performance.
Is that when you thought of yourself as either a conceptual artist or a folk artist?
Well, it seemed like in Nova Scotia, into the 70s, that as a Nova Scotian, you had a choice between either being a conceptual artist or a folk artist. Because while the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design was promoting conceptual art, although they did show every kind of art there, they had every kind of visitor there, as we know. The Art Gallery of Nova Scotia created a local folk art scene and promoted it and collected it. And I, at one point, curated with Sue Gibson-Garvey an exhibition about the intersection of folk art and high art in Halifax. And that could have been the death of folk art, I don't know, in Nova Scotia. But I still have a business card from the Folk Art Festival that says Primitive Folk Art by Dan Allen. So, bad faith goes from the bottom to the top of the art world. But that was one of the more entertaining, weird cultural, local, strange and odd intersections, because people like Jerry Ferguson and Bruce Ferguson, unrelated, were collecting and promoting folk art on their own, in a sense. They were interested in it. As a working or middle class Nova Scotian, you're kind of caught in between these two impulses.
Fascinating. Huh. When we talk about folk art, of course, one almost is immediately struck by the question of audience, particularly with respect to conceptual art. So I'm kind of curious what part your notion of audience plays in your practice.
I don't think I think of audience except when I have a commission of some kind in the library. I've never thought of audience, and in school we were never encouraged to think of an audience, and it was always expected that there'd be 2 or 3 people who might be interested in your work, but I just look back on my education, it seems as if people thought art was a hermetic activity, and that you would never encourage an audience. You would never do something that would pander or play to an audience. I'm sure I've done that since, but Because I have had these library commissions, which sort of coincided with me in 1981 taking up a file card size as my my own personal format. So, audience, I don't know. It was never part of my thinking. Obviously, I will show at certain galleries and not others, or I will want to be reviewed by certain magazines and not others. But it just doesn't seem to matter what your audience is. It really doesn't.
It's kind of interesting when you say that, because when I think back on this question of libraries and art galleries, the word we typically use for libraries is users and art galleries as audience. I wonder how the two string together.
Well, one of the ways that's really curious is how the ethos of art education in art galleries turned itself into what was called in the 90s and 2000s relational aesthetics.
Oh, yeah.
So you had basically, it's as if the art education departments in galleries had gone nuts, and finally were able to become artists. I know that's not how it actually works with Burkhardt and a lot of these other artists, but you could see, I guess this gets back to your question about audience, you could see how the public galleries' attempts to manipulate an audience becomes art. It becomes this very crude art.
Relational aesthetics.
Yeah. One of my, Carl Madsen and I did a work together that I think might be my most famous underground work, a poster that said, "Thank you for not involving me in your relational art project," which of course people believe is itself a relational art project. The hubbub over that's pretty much over, but again, I'm going to your previous question. This audience problem is still a problem
for everyone. I want to come back to something else. A comment that you made that all of your work is based upon Borges's Tower of Babel.
Yes.
Do you want to just explore that?
I read this. I've always been interested in libraries because libraries were as a child, were my entry into going into intellectual life. But I read the Borges story late. I read the Borges story, The Library of Babel, in 1980, and I thought, this is the story for me. And what it is, it's a story about a universal library which contains every book. And it contains every book made up, composed of a set of letters. I think he says 23, I can't remember. But also he says there's a special crimson hexagon which contains illustrated books. So that got me going. I also was interested in Borges's habit of footnoting his stories. I thought that was a kind of academic touch I liked. But that, in a way, that's been my entire work, is to attempt to fill out the Library of Babel, to illustrate it. And I've gotten pretty close, because I made thousands of things.
I suppose that's in some ways a more abstract notion of the relationship between folk art and conceptual art, but I just wondered, turning away from that, what your feelings are between the materiality of art and, of course, its quest for some kind of intentional or conceptual
Well,
expression.
I think that early on, people realized that the dream of a non-material art was just a fantasy. That was, even if it's photons on a screen, you can't deny that you've got a computer behind it or that there's a projector there. And so I'm really skeptical of people who think they can separate materiality from art making, and I've never believed that you could do that. And any attempts to do that, you might say that Robert Barry's radio wave pieces may have done that. There are a few other examples of artists who've done non-material things, but they really are trivial. The non-materiality part of it is trivial. And it remains a dream from maybe my generation and people slightly older than me that this could happen. And yet, you do have people who think that the conceptual art ethos predicted virtual reality, predicted the way we work now, the non-material, the seemingly non-material ways we work now. But we know that the internet is composed of tubes that go through the ground. We know there's a material basis for all of these things that we think are immaterial. But we have a religious heritage to deal with, and that I think spiritualist ideas are the source of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe the confusion between the conceptual and the spiritual.
Yeah, artists I think tend to be default Buddhists these days. I mean, because of people like John Cage, maybe, perhaps, and even Leonard Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
But there are very few serious Christian artists out there that I've noticed, and although we have this obviously a great history of Christian art, but so there's a default spirituality that artists take on, and part of that is a little bit dishonest because artists are pleading with you or making a case for you that their work is spiritual, that it is better than its materials, and in a sense it is, but because with a work of art, whether it's an Ian Carr Harris or a Rembrandt, once you get all the data, you're still deep in a mystery. You still don't get it. I mean, in many works, many of the simplest works that are called art are hard to get.
Maybe material is a passage to the spiritual rather than something material in the shopping sense.
It's sort of inescapable, and early on I got interested in physics, and physics is fascinating because it's so strange, and that's a place where we can go for some serious talk about materiality and so-called lack of materiality. I think. Other than that, I don't like the trade that people do on this materiality stuff.
You're sitting in front of a beautifully material work that has also, of course, this conceptual edge to it. And I wonder if there's something you'd like to say about that work yourself.
I make a lot of landscapes, and I make them all up. And it occurred to me several years ago, looking at the work of a fellow artist, Tim Shelton, that all of the landscapes I was making were treaty landscapes. They're the subject of some kind of treaty. And so since the 2000s, I've been making landscapes with sculptures in them, and the sculptures are usually modernist sculptures. And in a sense, these paintings are like a sculpture park. But I find often when I go to sculpture parks that the discontinuity between the work and the natural environment is quite jarring to me. It is quite stark. And especially maybe since moving to the prairies, where in many places trees are grown as windbreaks, and otherwise they're not there. So in a sense, trees are very sculptural. But again, all of these paintings are of sculptures in landscapes, and along with blanks. I've been, through my whole career, many artists, and myself included, been perplexed by the monochrome and the crazy history of the monochrome, going back to Malevich, and I occasionally go there try to figure it out.
One of the things that strikes me about this work, and of course about your practice as a whole, has been this decision, as you said earlier, to adopt the 3x5 library card catalog format. I'm thinking that in many respects there's this relationship between the object and the idea, and of course the system, which would be what the card catalog is about. Would you have a comment on that?
Well, I started this format in 1981 when the card catalog was still being used, but people were saying that it was going to be taken over by microfiche, and a few people were saying that it was going to be, everything was going to be computerized. But when I started, there were a few people who had done file card books. One of the people was a woman named Eleanor Antin, who did an installation at NASCAD in the library stacks. And we had a very sympathetic librarian named John Murchie, and he allowed me to do installations in the library. And he was hated by the art historians because people painted in the books and everything else. I mean, I wouldn't call NASCAD's library an academic library. And also, they would say, sometimes librarians would say, this magazine is ridiculous, Canadian art, it's trash, we're not going to renew our subscription. They would say outrageous things like this. So it was a real hotbed when I was in school, and so I started doing installations there. And then since then I've followed the controversies mostly through the writings of Nicholson Baker about card catalogs, about archiving, about the horror that happens when librarians try to get rid of things like newspaper editions and that sort of thing. And but I have librarian friends, but my relationship to a library, professional librarianship, is as an amateur and as an ally, I'd say. I have recently become friends with a librarian who does things called systematic reviews of scientific literature, and I've been told that that is cutting-edge science, that the people who are doing studies of studies, librarians, are doing the most advanced research that's possible right now. I thought, that's fantastic.
Nicholson Baker. Oh, I love his The Size of Thoughts.
He's a wonderful writer, and he's all over the place. But I usually read his library-related things. I think I first read them in Harper's, actually. Yeah, his essays in Harper's.
Okay. And thinking of that, I can't help but make the comment that, in a sense, these 3x5 images that construct the larger work that you have, for instance, the one that's here in the studio, really do seem to come to the question of the size of thoughts. Anyway, personally, I find that fascinating on this question of art as a relationship between the object and the idea. But I want to pass on from that as a kind of link to the question of the collector. And how you've seen your relationship to collectors around this, maybe around this question, but others.
I've made thousands of works, and I've sold them, and I've done commissions, but I've also given them away, and I don't think it makes a difference to the value of the work. I think the artist decides what the value of the work is, and then whether they give it away or sell it, it's still worth the same amount. So currently, my paintings are worth $350. So if I give one away or I sell it, it's still going to be worth, at least I'm asserting that it's worth $350. And Canadian Cultural Properties people agree with me. So you can get a tax receipt for $350. And if you go to a dealer and buy one of my works, it costs $350. But then for commissions, obviously, if I did a 5,000 work commission in Halifax, and the commission was for $430,000, and when that was announced, I immediately had a friend that said, "Damn it, you're only getting $86 each per painting. You're only getting $86 per painting." So
Cheaper by the dozen.
Cheaper by the Dozen, which is actually one of my favorite movies. I'm really interested in Taylorism, which that movie is based on. Is this notion of efficiency that we're all caught up in, and which, of course, librarians once were caught up in. I'm going way off the track, but the thing is, when you talk to librarians, they seem to be, in terms of their institutions, on the very edge of chaos. And everyone else thinks everything is orderly. Right. But sadly, people are allowed to use libraries, so.
Well, I have to tell you that, and this is fascinating, I think, in my own personal history, when I was working at the University of Toronto as a cataloger, I was talking with the chief cataloger in the main catalog card in in the main library. And we were going through it, and she said, "Of course, I never come here because I know there are so many mistakes in it. I prefer just to hang out in the catalog department and not dream what's happening in the main card catalog."
Well, the only library job I ever had was at Holland College in Prince Edward Island when I was going to an art school there. And my job was called shelf reading, one of the most wonderful jobs I ever had. But I realized, you realize quickly within, say, the Library of Congress system, how very easy it is to misshelve a book. It's very easy to do that.
And when you have students shelving books.
Oh my God, yes.
That brings up this, well, all of what we've been talking about perhaps brings up this question of the post-studio environment, as it were. And clearly you work in the studio, but...
I didn't always, though. The kids today have a backpack, a laptop, a cell phone, and some clothes. That's what they own now. And I got a lot of money almost by mistake through commissions. But when I was younger, of course, I didn't have a studio. But now it's just easy enough to have a studio, and that's why I turned part of my studio into a gallery, because I thought I can't use all this space. And I am content with just making art on the bus as well, but that could happen. But you know, I think it is odd when I talk to, say, students about studio visits, about why they feel they need to have a proper space to show their work, and why they can't do the laptop studio visit and that sort of thing. They seem to be very anxious about getting these qualifications to be an artist, which includes a studio and some work on the walls, and none of that is necessary to be an artist, really. I mean, none of it, I don't think. I mean, Gene Randolph and I have been doing this little project called Your Own Grad School, in which we go to places. We've done it a couple of times now, one time in Kingston and once in Newfoundland, in which we go through a kind of fake grad school where students work for a month in the gallery space, and then we have so-called crits, in which we tell them that we don't want to change their work and that everyone's going to fail. And these gatherings are wonderful, and I think maybe been productive for people. But like other kinds of art education are not necessary for arts production or for a person to be an artist. Artists don't need to know how to read or write, or it's a peculiar profession. Everyone we know does. I mean, people in the art world I can only think of 2 or 3 prominent artists who have not gone to art school. Locally, there's Agnetha Dick, and Alan McCollum didn't go to art school, and Andrea Fraser, who's a conceptual artist, never went to art school. So it's possible to be an artist without art school, even on the levels that we're used to engaging in, which would be called the international neo-avant-garde or whatever,
Mhm.
it's possible to still not have the qualifications. But otherwise, being an artist has no qualifications.
Mhm. We're talking about, I guess, the practice of art today and the question of whether a studio is really required. And I'm interested by the fact that, as you point out, the studio is hardly required. In fact, an art education is hardly required, given the changes that have occurred in art practice today. And you mentioned Andrea Fraser as a particular example of an artist who, of course, never went to art school. I wonder if that's a model for contemporary practice. I'm not sure just what is required for a person to be considered to be an artist. I know that there's a certain amount of anxiety, particularly in the art academies, around this question, and perhaps it's a non-problem. But it does bring into, particularly with somebody like Andrea Fraser and institutional critique, it does bring into focus the degree to which, I'm not sure if theory is the word to apply to this, but the degree to which philosophy and the construction of social context has become one of the key discourses in art today. Do you have a sense of that?
I would if I hadn't lived through and you hadn't lived through the conceptual art non-revolution, because all of the cliches of Western art were rejected in that era. And as we found out, what happens when you reject a deep cultural value, we attempt to do it, is that the next generation just rolls right over you and starts making monumental paintings again.
I'm going back to the studio.
We have even if you track Hollywood cinema's versions of artists, that's enough to keep the ball rolling, more than enough to keep the ball rolling. For the large majority of people whose ideas of what an artist is still, as we know, a romantic idea, an idea that's an 18th century romantic idea, which we cannot and maybe we should not get rid of. The institutional critique was part of the ethos of the instruction or the discourse that we were in at NASCAD with Benjamin Buchloh. And my version of an institutional critique was to attempt to use the library as my institution. It hasn't quite worked out. The library and art gallery are always related, but we were all thinking of institutional critiques a few years before Andrea Fraser, but she's very good at doing the performance art articulation of all these problems. But again, you can't wish away these deeply held values in Western culture. You just can't do it. They're reinforced by and why should you? I mean, they're reinforced by the museums. They're reinforced by daily culture, and it makes sometimes the entire art world seem like a marginal speck. I mean, you'll know that if you ever visit Venice during the Biennale. If you stop a typical tourist during the Venice Biennale in Venice, it's likely they don't even know what's going on. They're unaware that there's this thing called the Venice Biennale. It's been going since 1896. So again, maybe we should have known that you can't just overthrow idea. To a certain extent, feminism has done that. To a certain extent, but that's the only critique or art movement that seems to be coming close to so-called deconstructing the dominant discourse.
And when we come to the question of discourse, given that example, do you feel that there is, if the dominant discourse goes back, of course, centuries even perhaps, nonetheless, if that's the deep structure, do you find that today there's a more immediate structure that would seem to suggest a contemporary discourse?
Yeah, it's called the internet.
Technology.
Nobody knew the internet would be about cats. I mean, no one ever thought that these really smart people would spend all of their coding lives attempting to get likes. The internet has changed everything, but we're not sure how it has, and I think libraries and librarians have a contribution to make here. And maybe they can sort this out for us.
Well, let's hope. In some respects, I guess we're circling around the notion of authenticity. What would construct something that is real, if not original? Do you have any thoughts about about a contemporary?
It's this can the debates around authenticity can literally be had about the authenticity of literal artworks. For example, is that a Monet painting? And how come we have loved this painting for so long and we didn't realize it wasn't a Monet, etc. Those sorts of philosophical problems are inherent in the art world, and we forget that we have a lot of money at stake and a lot of connoisseurship and a lot of art history at stake when we say this is a fake Monet. So obviously Duchamp and the legacy of Duchamp has corroded our notions of authenticity, but of course the authenticity game is played with Duchamp as well. A friend of mine recently, Celia Rabinovich, recently discovered a new Duchamp, a pipe that he gave to one of his friends, and of course everyone's interested in this. And so the authenticity game applies to even our sainted critics like Duchamp. I think. There's no way to escape it, really. If you're taken in by a fake, you're taken in by a fake. You know.
People look for authenticity, don't they? The crowds at Venice you were just describing, if they're not looking for art to provide that authenticity in their lives, they're looking at, I don't know, the notion of travel, the notion of being in a place.
Yes, what a pernicious notion, yes, that tourism is.
Is that the new authenticity?
It's yeah, it extends to our daily lives. Of course it is. The authentic food experience in Venice, or I mean, it's ridiculous. It immediately gets you into not only philosophy but a kind of professional philosophical discourse. You cannot get into these questions without getting into philosophy and getting into some pretty tough thinking, I think. Day to day, though, I was, as I mentioned, I've curated shows about folk art, and one in particular called Uses of the Vernacular in Nova Scotian Art, because we'd rather use the word vernacular because art school trained artists were using this stuff. And in terms of authenticity there, as an example, you could interview artists who were working in a folk art style, who had gone through MFA programs. It's amazing how easy it is for knowledge to escape people, even if they go through the institution. So, and then if you met the Nogler brothers, say, these folk artists from the South Shore of Nova Scotia, there's no question that they are so-called authentic. They're not trying to fake who they are. They're illiterate, they're canny, they're very often canny, but they are uneducated. I mean, yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, it's a very tough question, especially with the avant-garde games in the post-Duchamp era, which is the entire last century. It can be very difficult to know what you're looking at, what the artist is about, what they're really trying to do. It can get very difficult.
So can the perseverance of being an artist. And at OCAD, where I was teaching, that one of the things that we constantly advised the students on was the importance of perseverance, and whether it was career or whether that is in the sense of a career that was very public or a career that was in fact their own thing. The question really came down to perseverance.
I agree, yes. So you have a student and they graduate and they have a first show, that's fine. It's the second show that you want us to see, because the first show will be based on their art school experience. But the second show will be something that shows they have the perseverance to stay with it. I mean, you need years and years and years and years of perseverance, though. I mean, it's...
Which your own CV obviously attests to.
Well, my CV is pretty short on education. I only ever got a BFA, and but started working at NASCAD because although they were anxious to get their programs credentialized, they did not care about your credentials. They didn't care whether you had an MFA or not. It just didn't matter. So I have a long CV, but it's spotty in places. There aren't any significant gaps that would suggest prison or anything like that, but but the education was a very odd one. I had 7 years of going to school in which I come out with a graphic design diploma and a BFA, so that hasn't hurt me, I don't think. Although I think the tiny size of my work may have hurt me at the beginning, because all my colleagues were making giant neo-expressionist paintings, and I was making tiny works. And
it sounds like the story of the tortoise and the hare.
Yeah, maybe it is. So many people give up art that you think that if someone goes to art school in their 20s, maybe you should wait till they're 40 before you even talk to them. It's kind of astonishing, the attrition rate.
And I guess some of the works that you have, including the one that you have up on the wall here in the gallery, there's a very frank eroticism that I would actually associate with something like Pompeii. I just wonder if you'd like to speak to that sense of the erotic.
Well, the Pompeians weren't Catholic, but I think
Pre-Catholic.
They're too early for Catholicism, but I think the art tradition still thrives on a certain kind of Catholicism. But I did works on the wall now as part of what's called the queer set. Now I'm not what you would conventionally call queer.
But my mother would understand the term.
Cisgendered. Well, the only queer stuff I do is in my art, really. And the library eroticism thing is something I haven't pursued to the bitter end. I mean, I know about the conventions of the librarian who takes her glasses off and lets her hair down, and also the pornographic tradition of sex in the libraries, and I suppose my art could be linked to that, but I've never really believed the librarian cliches, and if I have any figurative depiction, it's always called usually a librarian, and it could be anything. Librarians come in all shapes and sizes, and I suppose in some ways they may fit the cliche in that they're intellectual and they're capable of orderliness. But otherwise, everybody's a librarian who has a smartphone in their pocket now, and so we're trying to reconcile ourselves to that, I think. And the eroticism, I make paintings, I make a lot of photographs. I've never made what I call pornographic photographs. But some of my paintings, I think, would be pornographic. And yet, that's not where pornography is today. Pornography today is in streaming internet amateur porn. That's what and I don't make that. So what I'm doing is a kind of old-style pornography, perhaps, or an eroticism based in painting, which is part of a complex reconciliation I try to have with feminism by being a feminist and realizing I'm completely unqualified to be a feminist, but insisting that I have to be one anyway. So that's where that comes from. Maybe exploring a bit of the dark side, because I do make everything up, and everything I make is acceptable. I'm surprised that I won't go certain places. I won't.
Hmm.
There's certain depictions I won't make. I'm kind of surprised by that.
Hmm. I'd have to say that when I was looking at some of these works, that, and perhaps I'm bringing my own sense of humor to this, but nonetheless, when I look at these works, that I can't help but feel there's a kind of comedic performativity involved. And I did experience that at Pompeii. These works do remind me of that, and I wonder to what extent comedy or humor enters into the work.
The Villa of Mysteries in Cliff. I think comedy is a tough thing. I remember, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think the French mostly were starting to do this, to do overtly comic videos. And then you have artists like Erwin Wurm, who makes funny stuff, and Maurizio Catalan. You think, well, what's the place of this stuff? And then I was trying to take myself through this comedic art and maybe backtrack, and it made me think about the history of maybe stand-up or in art, again, Duchamp. You think, are the things he did funny? Is the early depiction in a Dada magazine called Wrong Wrong of two dogs sniffing each other, is that funny now? It's probably not funny. That's the problem I guess everyone would bring up with humor. How can you sustain a laugh? How can you be comedic over time? And we're all making art for the ages, so it's tough to... it's tough when you see work that you... This is true of many what we call sexist works from different eras, where you can't laugh because you're not getting the joke because it's a sexist joke, right? It's like a cultural divide there that you can't bridge. So I guess I'd say the problem with comedy is, how do you make it last?
One of the things about comedy that's often been noted is that it may very well be understood as the most socially critical vehicle. That if it's difficult to sustain the laugh, it's actually as the laugh dies that something critical emerges. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, but I'd also say it's got to be contemporary. Just by chance, I heard a Lenny Bruce album the other day at a friend's place, and I didn't get anything. I didn't get any of the jokes. I didn't get any of the references. And how do you keep comedy current?
When it's specific.
Especially in art, especially in something like painting, which is assumed to be a long-lasting thing. And if you look at Dutch genre paintings, or I guess I'm thinking mostly of say, an artist like Greg Kernow, who in many ways was comedic, but in many ways you're not going to get his humor now, I don't think. He might be a good example.
Interesting. In your experience, what critical strategies would seem to have worked, either those that you took on yourself or those that were directed towards your own work?
Well, I think that because early on I was encouraged and I took seriously the notion that you can be a writer about art and an artist. I think that was critical for me, and that has caused me a lot of torture, but nevertheless I'll stand by it. The critical strategy of writing about art, I think, is a good one, and it's really my position is a painter and a writer, which is unusual. There aren't that many painter or writers in Canada. Maybe Jeff Spalding is one. There's a few. With the other media, you can understand writing as being more compatible, perhaps, say, with a filmmaker who has to write a screenplay and that sort of thing. But assuming that you can paint and write and curate is something that was assumed in my education, which I continued, but and which I've had resistances to. Some of which are ethical. I mean, there are ethical problems about curating as an artist and writing as an artist, but though I guess you couldn't call that a strategy, but I pursued them all. I've written hundreds of articles about art, and I've had hundreds of shows of exhibitions painting. I think of them as distinct, as different ways of thinking, because when I paint, I'm being dreamy, and when I write, I'm trying to take all the words out of the sentence. So I think in general that would be it. This willingness to write and also to maybe curate exhibitions, because many people will recall this was just not done in say maybe the 1960s. It was only into the 1960s and 70s when people would do all of these things. Otherwise, it would never happen in the 50s, in that era. Although we have these pioneer people like Bertram Brooker, who won a Governor General's Award and made the first abstract paintings in Canada, and you sort of think, okay, he's a big exception. Nevertheless, he didn't do critical writing, and many artists do critical writing now.
I'm interested, one last comment, we were talking about Philip Monk earlier, and I noticed that Philip has stated quite recently, and in fact in his book launch recently, that he's deciding to retire, he's in the process of deciding to retire from curating to back to criticism, which is where he came from. And that suggests the notion to me that critical inquiry is alive and well, if Philip thinks he can go back to it. And critical inquiry is premised on really the analytical disassembly of things rather than the assembly of things, as would be the case in curating. Just one last thought on that?
Well, when I began, I did a curatorial apprenticeship when I was young, and there was no place to study curating. And now there may be too many places to study curating. And I agree with your distinction that critical inquiry and curating are not quite compatible. When you're curating, you are on the artist's side. If you're not on the artist's side, the artist is dead. Or you're doing historical show. But that's just the social reality of curating. And so I can understand his point of view. I can't understand the notion of retiring in any sense for an artist or a critic or a writer, unless they're forced to by disability. It doesn't make sense. I don't know any artists who've done that, even though I'm sure you could name some.
I think we can finish there.